Well, after, I want to say months, but it was probably close to years, because I think it was almost 2 years we spent walking through Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. We are now making a radical 180-degree transition from the major prophets and the fall of the city of Jerusalem to Paul's letters. And we're going to be looking now at 1st and 2nd Corinthians. One of the reasons I want to look at 1st and 2nd Corinthians is simply as a result of spending our time in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. I felt like, to me, I saw connections between those major prophets that I had never seen before until we walked through the three of them, one after the other. And so I thought it was really cool. And so I was like, what other book might I see an interesting connection by looking at them both back to back? And I was like, well, the obvious one would be 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. And so that's why we're looking at these two books. And I also thought it would be a great change of pace from the major prophets. So we'll do the same thing we did last time, which we're going to look at these books in a little bit larger chunks than we do on a Sunday sermon. I'm going to probably struggle a lot in how to break up 1 Corinthians. But we'll walk through it in a little bit bigger sections, going through the various lessons that Paul's trying to teach the Corinthians. We're going to start off with an overall introduction for this book, and then the second one, and we'll just follow the two back to back. So 1 Corinthians actually begins in Acts chapter 18 and not in the book of 1 Corinthians, because in Acts chapter 18, Paul arrives for the very first time at the famous and fabulously wealthy city of Corinth. 1 Corinthians 2, 1 through 3 actually tells us what Paul's mindset is as he is arriving in the city of Corinth. It's one that we might not expect. 1 Corinthians 2, 1 through 3 says, "And when I came to you, brethren, I did not come with superiority of speech or of wisdom, proclaiming to you the testimony of God. For I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling." And when we look at Paul's letter to the Corinthians here, when we look at Paul's other letters in Galatians and Ephesians, the one thing you would think about Paul is this is not a guy of weakness, fear, and much trembling. So how is it that Paul came about arriving in Corinth with this type of an attitude? And I never noticed it before until reading Leon Morris's commentary, his introduction to the book of Corinthians, is that part of the reason that Paul might have felt this way when he first arrived at this city was the failures that Paul had gone over before his arrival in Corinth. Because Paul arrives in Corinth in the midst of his second missionary journey, and it's interesting to track what happened to Paul before he arrives in Corinth. His first stop right before Corinth was in the city of Athens, and if you remember all his time in Athens, he has this very famous argument for the unknown God, so they are worshiping God without realizing it. To me, this is one of the most engaging and inventive and interesting sermons ever told, and the response to that amazing sermon was, a couple people get saved. It sounds like it's not even enough people to start a church, maybe a small Bible study. So his ministry in Athens was just kind of, sort of a dud. And his 3 stops before Athens would not have built up his courage as well. His 3 stops before Athens in order was first Philippi. If you remember anything about Philippi, you would know about the Philippian jailer. So the most famous thing about his time in Philippi was that he was thrown in jail and led the leader of that prison to Christ and was released from prison in Philippi on one condition. We will let you go from prison, Paul, as long as you leave the city. And so Paul left Philippi. He goes to the city of Thessalonica. When he arrives in Thessalonica, initially things are starting with such promise. People are getting saved. The church is very quickly being built up. We see evidence of this from the letter of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. We also see the reason why there's a lot of confusion in the church of Thessalonica when Paul writes the letter to them, because Paul doesn't spend a lot of time in the city of Thessalonica, because as soon as the church starts growing, as soon as people start coming to faith in Jesus Christ, the Jews are stirred to jealousy. They attack Paul, forcing him to flee from the city of Thessalonica for his life. They attack the home of Jason, where Paul is staying, one of the fledgling members of his church. Really talks about how they took Jason and basically dragged him out of his home, took him into the city square, and beat Jason down. And it almost seems like Paul fled from Thessalonica not to protect himself, but to protect all of the people in that church, for fear that if Paul stayed, it would be the church members who would be attacked instead of Paul. So if you look at his ministry, Philippi, Jews are jealous, gets him thrown in jail, goes to Thessalonica, Jews get jealous again, they get the members of that church beaten up, Paul needs to run away. He gets to the city of Berea, and before he's even able to get a ministry started in Berea, almost as soon as he lands, who follows him? And it almost reads like they must have been following in a ship right behind him. Like we got to keep that Paul in sight, because as soon as he arrives in Berea, Jews from Thessalonica show up, and they try to persecute him and attack him in Berea. And he leaves that city with great speed and has basically nothing happen. And then after getting persecuted in Philippi and thrown in jail, persecuted in Thessalonica, where the church members are beaten up and he needs to flee, showing up in Berea, where the persecution is immediately so bad that he has to leave that city as soon as it goes. He arrives in Athens, no persecution, but at the same time, nobody really cares. So those are Paul's stops. And then he arrives at the city of Corinth. So Paul arrives at the city of Corinth after being jailed in Philippi, ran out of Thessalonica, ran out of Berea even faster than he was ran out of Thessalonica, and then he receives what I think was probably the worst response for an itinerant pastor in Athens, which is he is just ignored. And then he comes to Corinth, which may have led him to show up in weakness, fear, and much trembling. And then on top of that, not only does Paul have to deal with the fact that even though there is a church in Philippi, there is a church in Thessalonica, which, I mean, could be a cool thing that you planted churches in both those cities, but Paul paid for it dearly. He arrives in Corinth, which is probably the city where, if he would have pre-picked all the places he was going to plan to stop in the second missionary journey, which it doesn't read that way, because it reads like he's sort of just going from place to place as quick as he can. If he would have picked all the cities he would have gone, he would have been like, you know, if I'm going to guess there's one place where we're not going to be able to plant a church, it's probably going to be the city of Corinth. Corinth was an ancient Las Vegas. You could probably possibly say an ancient New Orleans. Corinth was famous for three things. Corinth was famous for wealth, for sex, and for sports. Corinth was one of the great trading ports of the Roman Empire. The city of Corinth could not be in a more ideal location for trade. On the one hand, if you're doing trade east to west, the port of Corinth is the ideal place to stop in the middle of the Mediterranean if you're taking goods across the Mediterranean and taking them to Rome. So if you're just sailing across the sea and want to go to Rome, the halfway point where you're going to stop with the best port, Corinth. So a lot of people are going to stop there. And then if you're going up to the northern area in what is modern day Europe, the port for that is, again, it's going to be Corinth. So Corinth is an ideal port if you're trading goods east to west, west to east, and also if you're going north to south. So it sort of just had that ideal middle point, to the point where at the beginning of the Roman Empire, one of Rome's major battle engagements was against the Greek city of Corinth, and they destroyed that city, absolutely burned it to the ground, and within a generation, the city was thriving again because the Romans saw how valuable that point was. So it allowed access of goods from east to west, also up into Greece and Macedonia to the north. So Corinth was just attracting wealth like a magnet. Second, Corinth was famous for religion. It was famous for the worship of the gods. It was the central city for the worship of the goddess Aphrodite, the Roman goddess of love. During the days of the Greeks, the temple of Aphrodite was so massive and large that they had 1,000 priestesses in the temple who were performing whatever ritual someone might desire if they would go there to worship the God of love. So men would travel throughout the Roman Empire to go to Corinth to enjoy the pleasures of that city and the worship of Aphrodite. And there were also numerous other temples that were located throughout that city. So Corinth was really a central location for the worship of the Greek and the Roman gods. And then third, Corinth was the home of the Isthmian Games, which occurred every other year. So this was a biannual. Is that something that happens twice a year, right? I don't know what the term is for something that happens every other year. So every other year they would have basically Olympic-style games in the city of Corinth. And because of those sports, the citizens of Corinth were known for strength, they were known for youth, they were known for beauty, and they were known for wealth. So this was a city of pleasure and lust. This is not the type of place you would expect to find a thriving Christian church. And if you had a Christian church in the city of Corinth, you would assume that that church would have lots of problems with wealth and income of divisions, with sexual issues, with vanity, with pride. And what do we find in the letters of 1st and 2nd Corinthians? All of the issues that you would expect to find in that city. But before we get into the letter itself, let's talk about the planting of that church in Corinth, which we see in Acts 18, and I'm going to read verses 5 through 11. So the planting of the church is found in Acts 18, 1 through 17, and I'm going to read verses 5 through 11. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." Then he left there and went to the house of a man called Titius Justus, a worshiper of God whose house was next to the synagogue. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all his household. And many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and were baptized. And the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, "Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city." And he settled there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. So Luke tells us that Paul arrives in the city of Corinth, and I didn't read it, but the first 4 verses, it kind of sounds like Paul's just sort of sitting there in more of a depressed attitude, not really going out and doing a lot of worship, a lot of outreach and leading people to Christ. But we read that everything changes in verse 5. Like Silas and Timothy arrive, sort of give Paul an energy boost, and then Paul goes about preaching Christ. The Jews initially reject him in verse 8 outside of the leader of the synagogue himself. But when the Gentile Corinthians hear about the news of Jesus as Messiah, they are like, "This is what I need." And they believe, they are baptized, they are saved. And many Gentiles are being won for the gospel. But the interesting thing, and to me this is the most fascinating thing about this whole thing, is that it looks like things are going well. Many people are believing, they're being baptized. And if I'm Paul, I'm like, this is where I'm staking my claim. The Jews are not beating me. The Gentiles are getting saved. This is great. But even with the great things going on, he still needs to get a vision from the Lord at the night and say, "Paul, don't be afraid to speak here. And Paul, I think you should stay here." Because it looks like even in spite of the success, Paul's thinking to himself, "I want to get out of Corinth as soon as I can. Like, this is not where I want to be spending all of my time." And you got to wonder, were there just such issues with the people that are getting saved that Paul's like, "I have so little hair already." Because if you see all the artwork of Paul, he's always bald. Favorite apostle. Is he I'm pulling the last of my hair out, dealing with these people? But it looks like Paul wants to leave. And the Lord comes to him in a vision and says, "Don't. I want you to stay." And so Paul did stay. He stays there for 18 months, which appears to be a pretty long time, that it might have been the 2 longest ministries that Paul had in the midst of those 3 most famous missionary journeys. Probably spent the most time in Ephesus and in Corinth, but establishes a church there. My guess is he probably had several house churches among the wealthiest Christians of the city spread throughout Corinth. Sadly, things do not end well in spite of that charge to say, but right before Paul ends up needing to leave, the Jews rise up in opposition again, and they actually beat Paul with impunity right before the local judges. So we read in Acts 18:17, "And they all took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. But Galileo was not concerned about any of these things." So it looks like Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, probably a Paul along with him, they end up getting persecuted for their faith, and so Paul ends up leaving Corinth. And I really wish I would know the attitude that Paul had when he left Corinth, because while he left Corinth, it seems like the one thing that did not want to happen was that the Corinthian church did not want Paul to leave, because it looks like, based upon the evidence we have in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, that whenever the Corinthian church had a problem, that every time a problem happened, somebody in the church would shout out, "Who are we going to call?" And they'd say, "The Apostle Paul!" Not the Ghostbusters. And I say that because while we're in possession of 2 letters that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, we know that he wrote at least 4 letters to them, possibly more. And all of the letters that Paul wrote to the church of Corinth were all in response to either probably letters and direct communication that Paul received in the church of Corinth. So while we have the 1st and 2nd letters of Corinthians, I wish we had I guess since they were written to the Corinthians, I wish we'd have probably the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd letters of Paul, which would be the letters that the Corinthians church wrote to Paul. Like, what are you guys writing and telling them? Because it looks like they're writing to Paul all the time. But I say here that Paul wrote at least 4 letters to 1 Corinthians. Our positive 1 Corinthians was the 2nd, unless there were more even before that first one. And how do we know 1 Corinthians was not the first letter but the 2nd? And that's based on 1 Corinthians 5:11. In 1 Corinthians 5:11, Paul wrote, "But actually, I wrote to you." So this is a past tense verb saying, I already wrote to you. "I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother, if he is an immoral person, or covetous, or idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or a swindler, not even to eat with such a one." So Paul's saying if a brother is involved in these sins that we're dealing with, you say, "I can't eat with you until you walk away with those sins, and I already wrote to you about this issue." So it appears that in the midst of Paul's rebuke that he gave to them on immorality, that Paul had already written to them about that immorality in his previous letter. So Paul is writing to them about something he wrote in his first letter. 1 Corinthians is his second letter, and we know that in 2 Corinthians, there's a letter that took place between 1 and 2 Corinthians that Paul references that is not 1 Corinthians. So we know that there are at least 4 letters that were written to Corinth. Scholars who really get deep into Paul's writings sometimes actually call them the letters of Corinthians A, B, C, and D. And the ones that we have in possession are Corinthians B and Corinthians D. But we'll be looking at the 2nd and 4th letters to Corinth. But the reason to bring this up is just to further highlight that the Corinthians have a lot of issues that they're dealing with at this time period, and there is at least a part of the church of Corinth that is leaning heavily upon the wisdom of Paul in these letters. So what now do we find in the letters to the Corinthians? Well, especially 1 Corinthians is exactly what we would expect to find in a letter that was written to a church that was founded in a city where you would least expect to find a new church. And so Paul is dealing with an awful lot of issues. And not only would you expect them to have all of these issues because of what's going on in the city of Corinth, but you also have to remember the time period in which this church is planted. And that is, they did not have the letters of Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. They did not have the letters of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. The Gospel of John had not been written. Maybe Mark had been written at this point. Matthew and Luke probably had, well, I say we know Luke had not been written at this point because they're still in the midst of their missionary journeys, and Luke won't write Luke and Acts until all those missionary journeys are done. So the most information they could possibly have as far as New Testament writings that we have at this point is probably the book of Galatians. And then also, I think at this time period, there were probably small accounts of Jesus' life that were floating amongst the churches. Like somebody probably recorded, they probably had Mark's or Peter's or Matthew's recording of the feeding of the 5,000. And they just had that written down, and that was probably being circulated from church to church. So they probably had smaller writings of the Acts of Jesus Christ that had been written that hadn't been compiled together by the gospel writers. So they had parts of Jesus' ministry written down. They had the Old Testament. But a lot of the instructions that we lean on today, they did not have a part of. So while they were leaning on the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, maybe some records of Jesus' life, maybe the book of Galatians, that was it. So a lot of things that we know today, that we have cleared up in our minds because we can read the letter of 1 Corinthians, they didn't know about those things. So I think sometimes when the church of Corinth gets badgered on so much for its awful sins, for some of them I'm like, why should they know better? They hadn't had the instructions that we're able to have because we can read these letters. So I think we should go a little bit easier on them. But what content do we find in the letter of 1 Corinthians? And for some reason, all of my scriptures were out of order and at the very bottom of it there. Weird. Okay. I don't know what's going on. Okay. So our outline of 1 Corinthians. So what you would find in 1 Corinthians is one, this is the easiest book in all of the Bible to outline. This is the easiest structure to follow because it definitely looks like Paul wrote his first letter to the Corinthians, and then he gets a response back that is just basically a complaint list. Paul, we're having problems with this, and Paul, we're having problems with that, and these people said this thing, and did you hear those people are doing that? And so basically 1 Corinthians is a checklist for Paul where he's going over all of those issues that they wrote to him about in that last letter. And this is why at some point in the letter you just want to be like, oh, why can we not have that letter that was written to Paul? The one where we really need that information is the section where Paul talks about marriage. He talks about some things there where it's just like, what in the world are you talking about? And sort of part of the reason is that we don't have the other side of that communication. So the issues that Paul dealt with in the church of Corinth, we'll just go through the basic outline of that, and then we'll begin to tackle all of these issues starting next week. So he gives an introduction in verses 1 through 9, and I'll talk about how this introduction should not be overlooked as, oh, it's just the introduction of the book, it's not that big deal. To me, this is the most important introduction in all of the Bible to any book outside of the Gospel of John. So the Gospel of John's introduction is the most important with, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Second most important introduction is what Paul says about the church of Corinth at the beginning of the book. It is immensely important for our understanding of the whole rest of the book. So Paul introduces his recipients, welcomes them, encourages them, and then he goes into all the issues. So chapter 1 through chapter 4 of the book of Corinthians is all about divisions that are in the church. If you can remember those divisions, it appears that the church had broken up into various groups, where one group's saying, oh, we're followers of Apollos and all he says. And another group saying, oh, we're followers of Paul and all he says, we're the Paulites. And then you have the super spiritual people who are like, followers of Paul and Apollos, we're followers of Jesus. Take that. And so he deals with those divisions in the church, talks about how it's a sign of their childishness and their carnality with these divisions. Chapter 5, he is rebuking them for their immorality, their sins that are going on that Paul says are so bad the other people in the city of Corinth don't even do this. Next, he rebukes them for lawsuits against one another. And so this is dealing with the fact that apparently there are some people in Corinth who they're having problems with somebody else in the church, and they're saying, I'm taking them to court because of our financial issues. And Paul's saying that is an embarrassment to the church. One Christian should not sue another Christian in court, so he's rebuking them for their lawsuits. Chapter 7 is his teaching on marriage. Chapters 8 through 10 is the practice of Christian liberty, dealing mainly, it seems like the issue that's coming up is the issue of, can we eat food that are offered to idols? And you have part of the church saying, of course we can eat food offered to idols because they're just statues. Who cares if people offered food to them? They're not real. And then you have other people who are saying, don't you know about the demonic forces behind the idols? And if we eat food offered to them, that is a sin to us. And so there's that division over can we or can we not eat food offered to idols. And we get some of the most, while that issue doesn't apply to us as well, because I don't think anybody, like the last time I went to Bromart, there wasn't like a meat section of, this beef had been offered to, the god of Dagon, so we don't need to worry about this stuff anymore. But in the midst of this issue that we don't need to deal with at all, we get some amazing instruction on what do we do when we have a legitimate difference in the church and somebody has a moral opinion one way, some person has a moral opinion another way. This is one of the, to me, the gems of the book of Corinthians. Chapter 11 is instructions on the celebration of the Lord's Supper, where I'll go into the weeds a little bit on what Paul says on how the Lord's Supper should be instituted, and it is not the way 99% of the people do it in the church today, so we'll have a fun time there. And then in chapters 12 through 14, we'll look at spiritual gifts. I actually did this as a series 3-4 years ago in the summer, and so we'll go through the spiritual gifts again and what Paul says about the abuse of spiritual gifts, the most important spiritual gift being love. And then, what might be the best chapter in the whole book, the importance of the bodily resurrection in chapter 15. And to me, chapter 15 also highlights how seriously flawed the understanding of the Church of Corinth is. I think chapter 15 shows a greater flaw than chapter 5 with the immorality. Like we would always highlight the sin in chapter 5 as that must be the worst that's going on in Corinth. Well, we have people in chapter 15 of Corinth in the church who are saying, you know what? I don't even think Jesus really rose from the dead. And to me, that is a more profound error than even the sin error we have earlier in the book. And so if you want the full gamut of things that people are struggling with in the Church of Corinth, chapter 15 struggle is a doozy, but I'm thankful that they had that issue because it led to some wonderful, wonderful teaching on the bodily resurrection. So we will look at that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and then we'll look at the concluding thoughts in chapter 16. So there is what we're going to look at. Some of these sections I'll just go through in 1 week. Other ones I'll break up due to either the amount of time that's there or the quality of the instruction just deserves a little bit more. So we're going to spend a number of months in 1 Corinthians. I don't think it will drag, though, because this is all stuff where it's, this is super fascinating.